During World War II, some of the largest tank battles in history unfolded on the Eastern Front. The legendary Soviet medium tank, the T-34, played a key role in stopping the Nazi invasion and in the Red Army's subsequent advance all the way to Berlin. A symbol of victory was born, a steel giant on tracks, praised for its toughness, powerful gun, and sloped armor. From the outside, the T-34 looked like an impregnable fortress, but inside it hid a world of extremely harsh conditions. In this video, you'll learn what the everyday life of a Soviet tank crew looked like, what hardships tankers had to overcome in and out of combat, how they coped with the bitter Russian winter, omnipresent mud, hunger, and fear, and how they managed to keep their fighting spirit even in the most desperate moments. In a moment, we'll reveal what it truly meant to be a member of the legendary 34's crew. Let's look inside this steel colossus through the eyes of its crew. The 34 was a technical marvel for its time. It combined sloped, powerful armor, an effective gun of 70.2 mm caliber, later 85 mm, and a reliable 500 horsepower diesel engine. On paper, it was a perfect weapon, fast, well-armed, and relatively inexpensive to produce. T-34s rolled out of factories by the thousands and became the backbone of Soviet armored forces. However, any tank is only as effective as the people inside it. From behind the walls of Kremlin planners, it might have seemed enough to produce as many tanks as possible, but real life for the crews inside these machines was far from a comfortable ride. The crew of early T-34 variants consisted of 4 men: the tank commander, who also served as the gunner, the loader, the driver mechanic, and the radio operator bow gunner who manned the hull machine gun. Even this list shows the manning was austere, and some crew members had to perform multiple roles at once. For example, the commander was overloaded. He had to command the tank, monitor the situation, search for enemy targets, and also aim and fire the main gun. In a minute, we'll see how such task overload affected their chances in battle. But before we dive into combat, let's look at who these tankers actually were and how they were trained. Losses in armor and crews were enormous in the first years of the war. Throughout 1941, and especially 1942, many experienced tankers were killed or wounded, and the Soviet Union had to constantly replenish units with new recruits. Young draftees, often around 20 years old or even younger, underwent shortened training and were sent to frontline units after only a few weeks of drills. Imagine a driving school graduate who has learned only the basics of driving and is immediately put behind the wheel of a race car in the middle of a deadly competition. That's roughly how inexperienced tankers felt in their first battles. In training camps, they learned to start and drive the tank, fired the gun a few times on the range, and maybe once or twice practiced changing a track. But the reality of the front was a completely different dimension. In winter conditions, it was incredibly hard to start the engine, recalled one veteran about the accelerated training in the Urals. About 2 hours before a drive, we had to slide a large metal pan under the tank, pour diesel into it, and set it on fire. Only when the flame warmed the frozen engine did we try to start the whole tank, and soon we were covered in soot along with it. This memory illustrates what the newcomers were exposed to. They learned improvised tricks for handling the machine in the field. Ideally, the crew should have been able to substitute for one another's roles, but the short training often didn't allow it. Many drivers hardly knew how to handle the main gun, and loaders didn't know how to operate the radio, if their tank even had one. Tank commanders were often freshly minted junior lieutenants without combat experience, suddenly burdened with huge responsibility, to command a steel monster and the 3 other men inside it. It's hardly surprising that the first deployments of these fast-tracked crews often ended in chaos. In this video, in just a minute, you'll learn what it felt like to drive toward the enemy for the first time with minimal experience. But first, let's get closer to the physical and mental environment in which the crew lived inside the tank. Sitting in a T-34 for the first time was a shock for many. They might have expected a spacious tank carriage, but inside they found a cramped, dark space saturated with the smells of oil, diesel, and burnt propellant. Crew comfort received minimal attention in the T-34's design. As one Soviet tank officer later stated after the war, concern for the crew was limited to only the most primitive things. Sharp corners and protruding bolts lined the narrow passageways inside the hull. Seats were hard and basic. It's even said that by the end of 1941, when the Soviets were feverishly evacuating factories and boosting production, some tanks reportedly left the line without seats at all. The driver, they say, had to sit on a folded greatcoat. Perhaps that was an extreme case, but it clearly illustrates the priority. The main thing was to deliver the tank to the front. The crew would adapt somehow. The T-34's interior was cramped by nature. Sloped armor and the massive Christie suspension with large springs took up a lot of internal space. A post-war American test even found that when an enemy shell penetrated the T-34's armor, the likelihood of crew death or serious injury was dramatically high. It was stated that about 75% of the crew were killed upon penetration, whereas in the somewhat more spacious American Sherman, it was supposedly only about 18%. In a small volume, there was nowhere for fragments to escape, and they struck everything living inside. There was almost no lining on the interior walls. While Western tanks had light-colored interiors and semi-rigid seats with armrests, the T-34 was dominated by bare metal painted a darker protective color and the sharp outlines of equipment. Every bump and every sudden movement of the tank the crew felt in their own bodies. Bruises were commonplace. The only protection against knocks and concussions were the famous tank helmets with leather lining, which every crew member was supposed to wear. These helmets not only softened blows during jolts and sudden stops, when a head could easily slam against the turret's metal, but also partly protected from burns if the tank caught fire. No sane person would climb into a tank without his helmet. He'd risk a concussion and nasty injuries when the steel shell caressed him while driving cross-country. The cramped conditions were compounded by the poor ergonomics of the two-man turret on T-34-76 variants. Only the commander and the loader were in the turret. The commander, who also aimed and fired the gun, had virtually no extra space in his domed seat. The loader stood on the turret basketless hull floor, and here another problem arose. The T-34 had no rotating turret basket. That meant when the turret traversed, the floor under the loader's feet didn't move with it. He had to constantly step over ammunition boxes and shells, watch where he put his feet, and twist around in place while the heavy turret with the gun rotated around him. Imagine what an acrobatic act that had to be in combat. The tank bouncing, the turret turning, the loader balancing, pulling 20-kilogram shells from hard-to-reach niches and trying to ram them into the breach. Within seconds, in darkness lit only by muzzle flashes and sparks. No wonder that with such workload, the two-man turret team couldn't match the rate of fire and accuracy of better organized German crews, where the commander did not have to service the weapon directly. Another major limitation was visibility from the tank. Until late 1942, the T-34 lacked a commander's cupola with periscopes, such as the Germans had. The commander had only a rotating periscope sight with a forward field of view. Soviet tactics also prescribed going into battle with hatches closed. The commander therefore usually remained sealed inside the tank and couldn't stick his head out, since his seat had no position for driving head out. In contrast, German commanders typically looked out from the open hatch whenever fragments weren't flying. The driver had a single narrow viewing slit in his hatch, through which he saw only directly ahead. The other crew members had to rely on small vision slits and viewing devices. The feeling was truly claustrophobic, as if the entire crew were almost blind. One veteran remarked, with exaggeration, that the tank was nearly completely blind and deaf, something German opponents quickly discovered. There are reports that some T-34s did not react even after several hits, because their crews simply didn't notice from where the fire was coming. German gunners thus had time to fire even 3 shots at the same Soviet tank before it began to return fire. That's how bad the situation, with visibility and internal coordination, could be inside the 34s. The atmosphere inside the sealed tank was completed by noise and temperature extremes. Just behind a thin bulkhead next to the driver roared the 12-cylinder diesel engine. Its roar was deafening, making it nearly impossible to communicate by shouting. In practice, when the intercom didn't work or wasn't available, which happened often since communications gear was unreliable, the crew had to invent their own signals. The driver felt the commander's heavy boots on his shoulders. Pressure on the left shoulder meant turn left. On the right shoulder, right, a smack on the helmet, stop. Such stepping might sound funny on the training ground. In real battle, it was a matter of life and death. And then there was the omnipresent smell. Inside the tank, the aromas of oil, diesel, burnt propellant gases from firing, and the sweat of frightened men mixed together. Ventilation was weak. During long drives or prolonged firing, the interior filled with combustion products and gun smoke from the barrel. Crewmen's eyes often watered, and the irritating fumes made them cough, especially when they had to fire from inside with the hatches closed. In winter, by contrast, when the engine wasn't running, the interior was icy cold. In summer, the sun-heated armor turned the tank into a stifling oven. Thus, at any time of year, the T-34's crew suffered, either from cold or from heat, and always in noise, half-blindness, and the tight embrace of metal. In a moment, we'll reveal how these men handled combat in such an inhospitable environment. But before the battle thundered, let's see what the crew's daily routine included outside direct fighting. The romantic notion of tankers resting warmly inside their tank between battles is fundamentally different from reality. When engines and guns fell silent, hard work awaited the crew. The tank needed constant care, and frontline circumstances demanded further sacrifices of strength from the men. After a march or a battle, when the unit halted, the tanker's day did not end with rest. On the contrary, the merry-go-round of duties often only began. Right after a fight, the crew had to replenish fuel and ammunition, if it was even slightly possible. That meant hauling out spent shell casings, lugging new shells, each weighing over 9 kilograms, into the bowels of the tank, bringing or carrying fuel from barrels or a truck tank, and topping the diesel into the tanks. The T-34 had fuel tanks inside the fighting compartment as well, so handling fuel was risky and dangerous. Spilled diesel stank and made the floor slippery, and everyone was painfully aware that an interior soaked in fuel could become fatally engulfed in flames if hit. But there was no other way. The tank had to be ready to move out. Next up came the machine's technical condition, checking the engine and transmission, tightening loose tracks, inspecting road wheels and springs, cleaning the weapons. The whole crew turned into mechanics. Tank commanders usually didn't shy away from joining in, though sometimes it was said that the commander might skip the dirtiest tasks, like scrubbing the gun barrel with a brush or washing oily shells. Generally, though, everyone worked together. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made it in time, When a shelter for the tank or a slit trench under it had to be dug, all four grabbed shovels. Excavators and engineer units weren't always at hand, so tankers dug pits themselves to hide their vehicle from enemy observers or bombers. If there was time, they also dug a temporary dugout, a hole in the ground where they could spend the night. In winter, they often packed snow around the tank or camouflaged it with branches. In summer, they covered it with nets, grass, and twigs. When the situation allowed, the tank was literally a home for the crew, but with the barest minimum of comfort. Servicing the T-34 was also complicated because the reliability of the early production series was unimpressive. Official Soviet data from 1942 indicate that the average service life of a T-34 tank engine was only about 100 operating hours before an overhaul was needed. The transmissions had design flaws. Until 1940, they had only 4 gears and no synchronizers, so shifting required enormous force. Drivers sometimes literally helped themselves with a hammer, banging the shift lever to engage a gear. Off-road, the tank practically drove only in first and second gear because of the weak transmission. Trying to grab third on a rutted field track required superhuman effort and threatened to jam the gearbox. Such strain led to frequent breakdowns. Transmissions failed, engines overheated because filters clogged with dust, and early-type tracks tended to break. For the crew, that meant one thing: constantly fixing something. Whenever the tank stopped and wasn't in immediate danger, a small field workshop sprang into action. Bolts were tightened, coolant poured into leaky radiators, weak track links replaced. And of course, the tank had to be cleaned daily of mud, snow, ice, or dust, because a fouled machine would let them down at the worst possible moment. It's exhausting even to imagine. Young men, after many hours of fighting, often hungry and sleep-deprived, climb out of the tank only to face several more hours of maintenance and resupply. And yet it was necessary. They knew that if they neglected something, next time the machine might fail them in the middle of battle, which could be fatal. Tankers, therefore, often helped not only within their own crew, but between tanks. If one vehicle had issues, neighboring crews rushed to help. Today we'll replace your brake shoes. Tomorrow maybe you'll help us with a broken track. This mutual aid was born of necessity. There weren't always enough specialized repairmen at the front, and time worked against them. Now imagine everything is ready and the order to attack arrives. Engines roar. A column of T-34s moves toward the enemy. For the crew inside, this means entering hell, where seconds, luck, and the ability to keep a cool head amid chaos decide life and death. As soon as the tanks draw near the enemy, the situation inside resembles a storm in an iron box. Through his narrow periscope, the commander spots a muzzle flash, apparently an anti-tank gun or a Panzerfaust. He immediately shouts an order, but in the deafening noise, even the man half a meter away can't hear him, so he stomps the driver's shoulder to the right. Instinctively, the driver yanks the levers and swings the vehicle just as a blow rings out. An enemy shell has ricocheted off the sloped frontal armor. The turret shudders. A spray of tiny metal fragments peels off the inside walls. That's spall on the inner side of the armor, slivers of steel whistling like blades through the compartment. The loader cries out. A fragment sliced through his sleeve and into his forearm. He ignores the pain. Adrenaline takes over. He quickly rams another round into the breech. Meanwhile, the commander has laid on the target, or rather, on where he assumes it is, because he sees only fleeting outlines through the fogged sight. "Fire!" he yells, and presses the trigger himself. Inside the turret, the crash is like lightning striking a barrel. The 76mm gun fires. The shell casing ejects rearward, bounces off the armor. A hot, smoking brass tube rolls underfoot. In the cramped space, it's like having a smoke canister in your living room. Propellant gases instantly fill the fighting compartment. Eyes water, lungs choke, and there's no time to ventilate. Instinctively, the commander cracks his hatch open a few centimeters to let fresh air in. He risks letting fragments inside, but otherwise they'd suffocate. Seconds race by. Another hit. This time the tank jolts. The track has been struck. The driver reports the tank no longer responds to right turns. The track may have slipped off or snapped. The vehicle still coasts forward. The commander orders a halt. Rather than driving deeper into a trap, he decides to use the last available cover. The driver brakes. The tank lurches to a stop. We're stationary. This is bad. The thought flashes through everyone's mind, echoing a tanker's grim proverb. Once you stop, you're done. The enemy immediately takes careful aim at a motionless target. A crack. An anti-tank gun or tank gun punches through the turret's side armor like paper. Inside, a roar. A fragment hits the loader's leg. He collapses to the turret floor. Blood splashes on the inner wall. The commander doesn't wait for anything. "Out of the tank!" He bellows so loudly everyone hears it even without the radio. They know what it means. Their steel home has just become a trap. They kick open the hatches and scramble out. This dramatic scenario was, unfortunately, reality for many crews. Close combat with German tanks and anti-tank guns was extremely dangerous. The T-34s were fast and maneuverable, but once penetrated, the crew inside often had little chance. If an armor-piercing round got through, a storm of fire and metal erupted inside. Fragments from the shell and bits of the tank's own steel sliced through everything in their path. Ammunition stored inside could detonate. Especially in the first half of the war, the Soviets used ammunition whose explosives were prone to cook-off. When propellant or diesel burned inside, shells heated up and blew. The tank then turned into a fireball, and the crew had virtually no hope of escape. Tankers dreaded this fate. To burn alive in a sealed space ranked among their worst nightmares. Many veterans admitted they preferred risking a jump from the tank under fire to staying inside and burning. The statistics were relentless. Approximately 45,000 Soviet T-34 tanks were destroyed or put out of action during the war. That translates into tens of thousands of tankers killed or maimed. In some periods of frontline fighting, a tank crew's life expectancy was measured in weeks, sometimes even mere days or hours of active combat. For example, in the summer of 1943 at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, armor losses on both sides were devastating. A Soviet tanker went on the attack, knowing he might not survive the first engagement. Nevertheless, they went, and many a second and third time as well, if they survived their tank and were assigned to a new one. The inferno of tank combat wasn't just about the threat of death, but also about unimaginable psychological pressure. Every second, the crew had to function like interlocking gear wheels under enormous stress. Each man had to do his job automatically and rely on the others. A tanker couldn't run or hide. He was chained to his position. The driver saw only a narrow slice in front of him and blindly trusted the commander to lead him correctly. The commander, in turn, had to trust the driver to obey his signals even amid chaos. The loader relied on the gunner not to fire at the exact moment his hands were on the breech. Those were seconds full of shouts, often unheard, crashes, flashes, jolts, and pressure on the eardrums so intense that many veterans suffered partial hearing loss after the war. And yet, amid that deafening ode, they had to carry out orders coolly and react instantly to a changing situation. Despite all the shortcomings, Soviet tankers gradually learned to exploit the T-34's strengths. Its silhouette was low, and its mobility excellent, so they often chose a quick maneuver and closing in to the shortest ranges, where the advantage of German sights diminished. Sometimes they even resorted to ramming. When ammunition ran out or the gun failed, some crews took a desperate step and drove full speed into an enemy tank to disable it by impact. Such actions required incredible courage or desperation and often meant self-sacrifice, but they had a tradition in the Soviet tank school. From the very first days of the 1941 invasion, there are records of crews ramming heavy German tanks, even at the cost of their own lives. The T-34's mass and speed theoretically allowed it. But imagine the impact of 20 tons of steel. The crew inside would be shaken violently. Bones or the spine could be broken. Not to mention radiators and the engine were often pierced in a ram, leaving the tank immobile anyway. Even so, such feats were performed and are part of the legend. It is often claimed that the T-34 defeated the Germans not by quality, but by quantity and the crew's resilience. When one tank burned, another stepped into its place with a new crew. As one German anti-tank gunner bitterly remarked, "We knocked out 10 of them, and 10 more appeared." The Russians had so many tanks, and they weren't afraid to drive them into battle across mountains of wreckage. There is both respect and horror in those words. And today we know that behind each incoming tank stood other young men ready to climb into a scorching steel hive and meet death again and again. If a tanker survived a battle, the life of a field soldier awaited him. When they weren't in an attack, that meant long marches, waiting in trenches, nights spent in the cold, and constant readiness to jump up and fight again. Winter was, by most veterans' accounts, the worst period. The metal tank turned into a freezer. Inside, they could warm up a little by starting the engine, but that gave away their position and consumed fuel. 2 men could lie down on the turret and hull floor to stretch out a bit. The others had to stay outside or sit inside in cramped positions. Tankers often slept outside the vehicle, even if that seems illogical. They dug a pit and parked the tank over it as a roof. They threw a heavy canvas, tarpaulin, over it and weighted or buried the edges, making a temporary tent under the tank's belly. Inside, they hung small wood stoves with the flue poking out. That way they could warm it a bit, and the crew could at least for a time get warm and shelter from the wind. One seasoned commander boasted that throughout the war, he didn't sleep a single night under a house roof, always outside under the tank. That wasn't unusual for tankers, because they often operated far from settlements, or they weren't allowed to quarter with civilians for security reasons. The tarpaulin was absolutely essential kit for the crew. All veterans agreed that without a piece of canvas in the field, they wouldn't have survived. It served as a blanket, a roof, a ground cloth for eating, and, most importantly, protected the tank from rain and snow. Wartime T-34s weren't perfectly sealed. Water leaked through hatches and vision devices, so when the tarp went missing, it spelled trouble. One tanker recalled how a wind gust blew their tarpaulin into the Caspian Sea during a crossing, and they had to quietly borrow a spare piece of canvas, or the whole crew would have suffered from cold and damp. Without the tarp, being inside the tank was horribly bad. He summed up the miserable situation. Weather hardships were compounded by hunger and exhaustion. On offensive drives, when they advanced for, say, a week straight, field kitchens sometimes couldn't keep up with the units. Tankers then ate nothing but hardtack and canned food they had with them for several days. One veteran recounted how during an advance they ate only hard, dry bread for a whole week, washed down with cold water, and were glad to have at least that. Sometimes locals helped. In liberated villages, grandmothers brought tankers milk, potatoes, or a loaf of bread from their own stores. Soldiers jokingly called it grandmother rationing, as if an unofficial supplement outside the Army's official rations. Any such home-cooked food was a welcome break from the monotonous, modest wartime diet. When they were lucky and had time, tankers warmed up canned meat, so-called tushonka, right on the engine. It was enough to set a tin on the engine block, and within minutes it would bubble. Hot food in the cold worked wonders for morale. Often, though, there was neither the time nor the food. What about hygiene? Frankly, most of the time tankers were dirty from head to toe. Their overalls and leather jackets were covered in a layer of grease, dust, and soot. After each repair, they looked like chimney sweeps. After each road march, filthy again. There were no conditions for bathing or changing. If a rare pause behind the lines presented itself, soldiers used field baths and got clean underwear. But sometimes they went weeks without seeing soap or warm water. With that came a major soldier's enemy, lice. These parasites tormented infantry in the trenches and didn't spare tankers. Some veterans claimed the opposite, that grease and oil repelled insects. Anyone who says tankers didn't have lice because of oil has never served in a tank, one eyewitness countered. The truth is, most tankers complained about lice. After every prolonged action, as soon as there was a pause, soldiers lit fires and roasted their uniforms. They literally stripped, hung jackets and shirts on poles over the flames, or tossed them into a barrel with a bit of water at the bottom and heated the barrel. Steam and heat drove the lice out and burst them. By the fire, it allegedly crackled like light machine gun fire as insects died in the seams. That was the only reliable way to get rid of the co-tenants. When possible, mobile field baths arrived, rail cars or trucks with steam equipment, where laundry could be boiled and soldiers could wash. But right on the line, that was a luxury. Tankers got used to living in dirt. One of them admitted, "We had quilted jackets and felt boots, but once they got oily and dirty in the tank, they didn't last us long, and we didn't get new ones." By the end of each operation, they looked like beggars, mixed in German tunics and civilian trousers. You could recognize a Russian tanker only by his helmet. So much for the appearance of these heroes, certainly not the polished look of later movie soldiers. They were unshaven, black with soot, wearing whatever was at hand and not full of holes. Sleep was another chapter. Lack of sleep was constant, especially during offensives. Crews drove for many hours at a time. Try to nap inside a rattling tank filled with noise. Even so, soldiers learned to sleep in snatches when they could. On long road marches, the driver sometimes nodded off at the controls if the commander watched over him. Commanders took turns on guard when in camp. One man always had to be alert and on watch in case of alarm. The other three slept wherever they could, outside next to the tank on blankets in warm months. In winter, in the temporary bunker under the tank by the little stoves, as described. Sleep was restless and often interrupted. Soldiers were so exhausted some even dozed during movement in battle, falling into micro-sleep for a few seconds from sheer fatigue. Such extremes weren't uncommon. Chronic exhaustion brought stress. Many tankers' hands shook after battle until they caught their breath again. The psychological strain meant that even in relative quiet, some couldn't fall asleep at all. Their minds replayed scenes from combat. Today, we'd call it a post-traumatic reaction. Back then, it was simply nerves. There was no therapy, at most a swig of vodka to calm down, if any was at hand. How is it possible that under such conditions tankers could keep fighting, sometimes for years? The answer lies in a mix of cohesion, determination, and a measure of propaganda. A tank crew was a small group that had to rely absolutely on one another. Over time, they became very close comrades. They knew everything about each other, went through hell together, and depended on one another. Such bonds often grew into a brotherhood. Tankers called each other bratok, brother, and they truly felt that way. One veteran recalled that on his 19th birthday, in field conditions, he shared a bottle of vodka with two crewmates and felt then that those guys were closer to him than anyone at home. They mixed the war's brutality with little joys, and it bound them forever. Crew cohesion was at times a matter of survival. They knew one man's panic could get them all killed, so they supported each other mentally. When one got jittery, the others immediately calmed him. "Easy, we'll handle it. Hold on." Informal humor and sarcasm were remedies against fear. Tankers joked about things that would make a civilian faint. They gave nicknames to their tanks, sometimes cynical ones. One battered T-34 was dubbed the crematorium, after they saw a charred crew inside another machine. Grim humor helped them cope. Rituals and superstitions also played a role. Some knocked on their gun for luck before an action. Others carried a talisman, a small icon, photos of loved ones, or a found German badge, anything to which they attributed protective power. The famous slogans painted on tanks, "For the motherland" or "For Stalin," also served a psychological purpose. The crew felt they were fighting for something greater and drew courage from that. Propaganda and patriotism had a significant impact. From mid-war onward, each tank had a radio installed, so the crew could listen to broadcasts and news. Tankers followed reports of frontline advances closely. Every day, the politruk, the political officer, informed them about the situation elsewhere, and read, for example, fiery articles by Ilya Ehrenberg, who called for hatred of the occupiers and for courage. Many tankers remembered that these moments, hearing about the victory at Stalingrad or reading letters from home, lifted their morale. They realized their sacrifices had meaning and that the entire country counted on them. They were young and susceptible to propaganda, but they had also personally witnessed Nazi atrocities. So they had motivation. Not all fought out of love for the regime. Many simply wanted to survive and return home. But they knew the only road home ran through victory. Another important element was pride in their machine and their unit. Although the T-34 plagued its crews with discomfort, many tankers wouldn't hear a bad word against it. They knew they had a tank, which in its technical parameters at least partly offset the enemy's early war superiority. In 1941-42, it was said that one T-34 was worth several old light tanks, and the Soviets extolled it in newspapers as the armored knight of victory. Crews felt a certain prestige. They were tankers, elite troops who had received the best equipment of their time. That pride carried them through many moments, even when they sat in a mud-splattered foxhole, teeth chattering with cold. They knew that as soon as the order came, they would climb onto their machine and could defeat the enemy with it. Of course, reality wasn't only uplifting patriotism. Crews also experienced conflicts, nervous breakdowns, and tragedies. When one crew member was killed, it hit the others hard. But war didn't allow long mourning. A replacement arrived quickly, and they moved on. Some commanders struggled to get used to commanding older soldiers or to bearing responsibility for their subordinates' deaths. Disobedience or cowardice was punished severely. sometimes even by court-martial and execution. One tank officer recounted how a polytruck reminded him that if he abandoned his damaged tank without orders, a tribunal awaited him. The order was stark: either save the machine or die trying. Such hardness was part of the Soviet way of war, and it put even more pressure on the crew. At times, crews preferred to burn in the tank rather than flee and face accusations of cowardice later. These are extreme cases, but worth mentioning for a complete picture. Despite drill and fear of punishment, the vast majority of tankers fought primarily out of personal conviction. They knew why they fought. It was enough to glance at ruined villages and the horrors committed by the occupiers. Their anger and determination were real. They gritted their teeth and endured unimaginable conditions, believing every sacrifice helped defeat the enemy. Some tank crews' stories became legendary. For example, Dmitry Lavrinenko, the most successful Soviet tank ace, destroyed over 50 enemy tanks in just a few months of 1941 with his crew. Lavrinenko fought in a T-34 and, although he ironically died outside a tank, killed by an artillery shell, his record boosted many tankers' morale. It showed that an excellent crew with its machine could work wonders. Other heroes, like Alexander Oskin, who in the summer of 1944 in a T-34-85 unexpectedly destroyed a German Tiger II, also went down in history. These fates are told and retold, but the flip side is often forgotten. How many nameless crews perished in silence, without witnesses, only as a number in statistics? Each such case had its own horrific course. Young lives snuffed out in flame or explosion. When a tank exploded and burned, what remained was a charred skeleton. Inside, usually nothing that resembled a human being. One veteran described how after a battle he saw the burned remains of a crew in the wreckage, shrunken into a mummy-like form the size of a small child, the facial skin dark brown-red. It was terrifying to see then, and awful to remember even now. Tankers carried such experiences for life. Many of them suffered after the war from nightmares, sudden anxieties, or health issues from their wounds. Burns, lost limbs, damaged hearing, shattered nerves. That was the price many paid, even if they survived. Despite all this, most veterans did not regret it. They said, "There was a war. We had to do it. I would do it again." That points to a deeper motivation. They defended their country against a mortal enemy. Soviet propaganda called them the steel shaft, steel in machine and in spirit. Ceremonial songs praised 3 tankers, 3 merry comrades. The famous song Try Tankista, though in reality, T-34 crews were of 4 or 5 comrades. Joy often did not meet them at the front, but friendship and mutual support did. By war's end, the Soviets managed to improve conditions. New T-34-85 versions had a more spacious turret and a 5-man crew. The commander no longer had to service the gun and finally received a panoramic cupola with periscopes. Communications improved too. All tanks received radios, so waving flags in battle was no longer necessary. These changes increased not only combat effectiveness, but also made life inside the tank a bit more humane. Suddenly, in the T-34-85, there was one extra man, the dedicated gunner, which eased the workload on the commander and loader. There was a bit more space inside, and heating, ventilation, and other elements saw improvements. Of course, it was still a cramped tank, but compared to before, crews saw it as significant progress. All this, however, came only after thousands of tankers had endured the worst. When the war ended in victory, thousands of seasoned tank veterans returned home. They were rightly celebrated as heroes. But few civilians could imagine what they had truly gone through. Their stories emerged only years later in memoirs and interviews. Thanks to that, we today know how harsh and merciless the life of T-34 crews was during the war. The story of Soviet T-34 crews is not only one of suffering, but also of human ingenuity, courage, and adaptability in extreme conditions. These people, confined within a machine of steel, created their own micro-world, a brotherhood that continued after the war. Their experience was not lost. After the war, armies learned lessons. Modern tanks pay far more attention to crew comfort and safety. Today's tankers have complex communications, air conditioning, fire suppression systems, and special armored partitions protecting ammunition. All this is a legacy paid for with the blood of T-34 crews and other tankers of World War II. Knowledge of what it means to fight inside a tank led designers to increase crews' chances of survival, from better armor to emergency exits and more ergonomic layouts. Yet the story of T-34 crews lives on not only in technical innovations. Every year in post-Soviet countries, Victory Day is celebrated, and with it, the tank veterans. Their courage is remembered, reunions are held, and on many monuments, it is the T-34 that stands, the symbol of victory. The younger generation today knows the T-34 from films, video games, and parades where these tanks still roar in honor of past victories. It is important, however, not to forget that inside those iconic green silhouettes lived and fought people of flesh and blood. Their everyday heroism wasn't showy. It was about enduring one more freezing night, starting the engine again and again, not giving up even in the face of horror and pain. Today's tankers, whether they sit in modern machines full of electronics or in some armies, still train on older tanks. Look at those veterans as their predecessors. Circumstances have changed, technology has advanced, but the essence remains. Inside every tank is a small human collective that must pull together under very difficult conditions. Whether it's the crew of an ultra-modern 21st century tank or 4 men in a scorching T-34 outside Stalingrad, it's always about courage, coordination, and trust. When we look at historical footage of battered 34s, we can admire the technology, but we must not forget the stories inside. Behind the Red Army's glorious victories stood the enormous sacrifice of these crews. Their lives were truly harsh. Every hour at war was purchased with sweat, blood, and often lives. When someone today climbs into a museum T-34, he may be surprised by the cramped interior or Spartan fittings, and still won't experience the extremes of battle. This confrontation with history reminds us how far we've come. Thanks to veterans' accounts, we can appreciate peace and progress. The life of T-34 crews during World War II left us a legacy of courage and a warning of what real war means. It is a testament to the determination of the human spirit to overcome unimaginable obstacles. So next time we see the legendary T-34 on a monument or in a documentary, let's remember the sweaty, exhausted, brave men inside. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If this look at the life of tankers interested you, I'd be glad if you give the video a like and share it with others.